Okay, my little otter daughters, Mommy's gonna read you a story now, just like I did when you were little baby girls, and then we're gonna go night-night, okay? So today's story is If You Take Away the Otter by Susan Buhrman-Deever, illustrated by Matthew Trueman. We'll put our little golden snitch down here in the corner, and we'll get started. If you take away the otter. In the Pacific coast of North America, playful sea otters hunt for sea urchins in the lush kelp forests beneath the waves. But there was a time when people took the otters away, hunting them for their thick, warm fur and almost driving them to extinction. Without sea otters to eat them, an army of sea urchins grew and devoured the kelp. Entire kelp forests were lost, along with all marine life that depended on the kelp for survival. But when people protected the sea otters, their numbers began to recover, and so did the kelp forests. This is the story of that loss and recovery. If you take away the otter. Ooh, there's our little otter. It's the otter and the golden snitch. Woo! If you take away the otter. On the Pacific coast of North America, where the ocean meets the shore, there are forests that have no trees. These forests are not on land. They're ocean forests, forests of kelp. Kelp is a large marine algae, or seaweed. Like the plants we see on land, algae make food from sunlight. There are many different types of algae. Some are just a single cell, meaning they're really, really tiny. And some are much larger, like kelp. Whoa, did you see this? Here's a big thing of kelp. Oh, and here's our otter. The kelp act as trees in the forests. In these forests, it clings to the rock at the bottom of the ocean and grows up towards the surface, sometimes reaching more than 100 feet. That's 30 meters. In between and under the towering kelp, smaller seaweed grows along many different kinds of animals. Kelp forests are full of living things. So kelp forests help slow down strong waves, sheltering animals and protecting the shore from washing away. And kelp grows near the shore where the water is cold and clear and where the ocean floor is rocky. It attaches to the rocks with special parts called holdfasts, which look a little bit like roots and keep the kelp from floating away in the waves. Abalone and clams, sea stars and octopuses, feathery sea worms, and swarms of tiny swimming shrimps live in these forests. Crabs scuttle and snails slink up and down the kelp blades. Spiny sea urchins creep about on tiny tubes. Look at all these animals in here, these mammals. We've got the snail, the sea urchin. See a sea star and an octopus. And a crab. And down here there's all these little itty bitty little sea shrimp. So thousands of tiny creatures can be found on and around a single kelp. Different parts of the kelp house different animals. Some creatures live near the holdfasts on the ocean floor, and some live on or around the leaf-like blades close to the surface. And swimming all around are fish, shy kelpfish, big-eyed rockfish, and bright spotted greenlings. Schools of silver herring and striped mackerel lay their eggs in these forests. Look at this. A group of fish is called a school of fish. Kelp forests are good places for young fish to grow up. There's lots of food, and there are many places to hide from predators. Yay, my favorite part. Sea lions and bald eagles fish these forests for their suppers. But the king of these forests, the hungriest hunter, is the sea otter. Otters dive into the deep and fill their bellies with fish and clams, snails and crabs, abalones and octopus, and the prickly, spiny sea urchins. A sea otter needs to eat a lot to help keep it warm, about a quarter of its own weight each day. If you ate like an otter, you would need to eat about 24 hamburgers a day. Holy moly, that's a lot of hamburgers. All living things in these forests are connected. The kelp and other seaweed make homes and shelter for animals. They provide food too. Animals like abalones, snails, and sea urchins eat the kelp and seaweed. And some animals, like the sea otter, eat other animals. There's just enough seaweed eaters, and enough meat eaters to help the forest thrive. But there was a time when people took the otters away. Indigenous people had lived alongside otters for thousands and thousands of years. But then new people came to this coast. They wanted the sea otter's fur, which was thick and soft and the warmest of warms. They wanted to sell it around the world. They took more and more, hunting the otters until almost all the otters were gone. People do not always understand at first the changes they cause when they take too much. When they took away the otter, the kelp forest began to change. Sea otters have the densest fur of any animal. There are around 1 million hairs in a space the size of a quarter. The international fur trade, which began after Russian explorers came to Alaska in 1741, changed everything. Thousands of indigenous people died from violence and disease. Fur companies forced some indigenous peoples, like the Aleut, to hunt for them. More otters were killed than ever before. Where once there were 150,000 to 300,000 sea otters, by 1911, only 1,000 to 2,000 otters survived. Look at this sweet little cuddly otter. This is why Mommy named my company Golden Otter, because I'm the mama otter and you're my little otter daughters. There's Daddy, and Grandma, and Grandpa, aunts and uncles, little sea otter families. Without otters to hunt the urchins, more urchins stayed alive each year. Those urchins made more and more urchins than had ever lived in the forest before. An army of urchins. And it takes a lot of food to feed an army. The urchin army crept along the ocean floor, looking for its seaweed food. They ate the small seaweeds. They ate the kelp where it clung to the rocky bottom. One by one, the kelp was cut down, and the ocean forests fell. Sea urchins usually eat drifting seaweed, but when there are a lot of urchins, they will also go after the kelp. They chew away at the holdfasts. Then the whole kelp breaks away and floats free. See, they chew it down here at the bottom, and then it breaks away from the bottom seabed floor and then floats away. Gone were the stands of towering kelp and the shelter and the food they gave. Gone were the homes for the kelp forest fish and the safe hiding places for their babies and eggs. When kelp forests disappear, the numbers of kelp forest fish go down also. When eagles can't find enough fish to eat, they hunt other birds instead. When the ocean floor is covered with hungry urchins, Any new kelp that starts to grow is quickly eaten. These places are called urchin barrens because the land is barren, it's empty. People do not always know at first why changes are happening beneath the waves. But they could see that the otters were becoming harder and harder to find. And that made some people worry that the otters could disappear forever. So they made new laws to protect the few otters that were left. In 1911, the United States, Russia, Japan, and Great Britain signed the International Fur Seal Treaty, which stopped non-indigenous sea otter hunting and the selling of otter furs. People worked hard to protect the remaining otters and made sure they had a safe place to live. And slowly, the otters began to come back. And the otters, those hungry hunters, attacked and ate the sea urchin armies. With fewer urchins creeping about, new kelp could once again grow tall, dancing in the waves. Where the otters have come back, so have kelp forests. This little bulb here reminds me of growing up in Alaska. Mommy and Uncle Augie and Uncle Austin used to find these big sea kelp bulbs on the ocean, like along the shore of the ocean, of the Pacific Ocean. And we'd swing them around at each other. And they'd go pop. They'd make this big, loud pop. We'll go look at him next time we're in Alaska. Look at this little guy with his sea urchin. So cute. There's my otter. When people protected the sea otters, they protected the forests. Those forests are homes again for crabs and snails and seaworms and shrimps. They make safe places for fish and their eggs. There's food for the seaweed eaters. There's food for the hunters. There's just enough of everything to help the kelp forests and all that depends on them to thrive. Look at the otter cuddling its kelp. It's like, ooh, I love my kelp. Kelp forests, sea otters, and people. Kelp forests provide homes and food for an abundance of marine life. They also protect against coastal erosion and take in large amounts of carbon dioxide, which helps fight global climate change. But overgrazing by herbivores such as sea urchins can quickly destroy kelp forests. Urchin-eating predators like sea otters help to protect them. Sea otters have played an important role in the cultures of the indigenous people of the northern Pacific coast for more than 12,000 years. They use their furs in trade and other traditions, and continue to do so today. Traditional hunting could reduce sea otter numbers near human settlements, but it was the international fur trade that caused dramatic, widespread change. After Russian explorers came to Alaska in the mid-1700s, fur trading companies began selling sea otter pelts for high prices in places like China. So many otters were killed so quickly that they were almost extinct by the early 1900s. This trade was also devastating to indigenous peoples on the northern coast. The Aleut and Alakite men were forced to hunt for fur companies. They were sent on long trips away from home and their families and often faced starvation. Many were forced from their homes. They experienced disease outbreaks, violence, and accidents at sea that led to the deaths of thousands of people, and the traditional ways of life were permanently changed. There are around 10,000 sea otters in the wild today. In some places along the coast, people who depend on shellfish for food or income face challenges as they compete with growing numbers of hungry but protected sea otters. In other places, like the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, sea otter numbers have fallen again in recent years. Scientists are still trying to figure out why, but it may be because orcas, killer whales, have started hunting them. Sea otters are also threatened by disease, pollution, and oil spills. The northern Pacific coast is changing. People are studying how the otters, their return, and the regrowth of kelp forests will affect life along the coast for both wildlife and people. If we take care, there is hope for balance, a balance where sea otters and the kelp forests they protect can thrive for many years to come. Acknowledgements. The author wishes to thank Dr. David Duggins, Dr. Ann Solon, and Dr. Douglas Velty for their advice and for reviewing the text for accuracy. For more information about sea otters and kelp forests, some books you can read are A Raft of Sea Otters, The Playful Life of a Furry Survivor by Vicki Leon, or Sea Otter Heroes, The Predators That Saved an Ecosystem by Patricia Newman, Life in a Kelp Forest, Undersea Encounters by Mary Rhodes and David Hall, Sea Otters, Living in the Wild, Sea Mammals, Portsmouth, New Hampshire by Louise Spilsbury, and Beneath the Waves, Exploring the Hidden World of the Kelp Forest by Norbert Wu. Lastly, some websites that you can visit are the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which we love to take our otter daughters to, right, girls? And see their kelp forest. That's www.montereybayaquarium.org. You can check out their Southern Sea Otter exhibit while you're there. That's my favorite thing to go to while I'm there. You can also check out the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where they're celebrating 200 years of science, service, and stewardship of the Pacific Northwest, looking at the Pacific Fur Seal Treaty of 1911. You can also look at their information on what lives in a kelp forest. And last, but certainly not least, check out the National Park Service, sea otters in Glacier Bay in my home state of Alaska. This book was written for Aaron and Always the Author's Boys, S.B., and the illustrator for Liv and Timo. That's it. And that's what happens if you take away the otter.